Let's look at it another way. Looking at these Chinese figures, could China be the driver for global growth, especially in Asia?
I'm glad you asked that question. I think I have to bring back a word of caution here, because as much as China's production has really been so strong, as we've already mentioned, much of the strength also came from infrastructure and a policy directive toward boosting domestic demand. Unlike 2008, where a lot of the stimulus went to consumers, and consumers actually bought goods and services from the rest of the world and acted as a global locomotive, much of the stimulus this time is going to incentivizing factories to restart, incentivizing infrastructure spending, and much of that stays at home. So the possibility of China becoming a locomotive for growth is really much more limited this time. And I would say that a lot of the consumption patterns, the composition of consumption, has also been primarily toward luxury goods and domestic luxury goods, because most of us were very surprised by how slow actually consumption actually took off, considering there was actually no international travel. So whatever would have been spent abroad was spent at home. And despite that, the consumers were still a bit cautious, so that their spending is still about, 30% shy of what it was last year to date. So there's a lot of hesitation on the part of the private sector in China to really carry on the kind of locomotive that it used to play in the past.
So, William, what do you think needs to happen then in the year ahead?
I think one of the things that China has to do, of course, is to restore its role as an integral part of the global supply chain, and much of the policy tensions that have come about even before the COVID-19 hit has to be addressed, about trade agreements, having a framework where the trade and services and intellectual property protection has to be established. So these are the sort of the old priorities that have to be brought back into gear again, because China and the U.S. are the two largest economies in the world, and we need to develop a framework for trade in the 21st century. Until that happens, the kind of spats and sparring that goes on between the two countries is certainly not going to be helpful for encouraging global growth.
Einar Tangen, looking, William Lee just mentioned global supply chains. You look at China's exports, they represent 17% of the country's economy. That's double what U.S. exports represent to its economy. And President Xi Jinping has been talking about self-reliance. How does China lessen its dependence on these overseas markets?
Well, I don't necessarily know that it's going to be a lessened dependence, because China has to import a lot of its basic goods. I mean, the raw materials, whether it's oil or ore or whatever, in order to sustain not only its exports, but its internal markets. So when you talk about China being a driver of the economy, it's a lot about these raw materials, whether it's food to energy. So I would just see that a little bit differently from my colleague. Also, just please note that retail sales year over year are up for the entire year, almost 1%, 0.9%. So that you've seen a real increase in consumption. There are worries around, especially with debt and unemployment, bad loans, etc. But the confidence that's going forward is really quite extraordinary. And what I'm not hearing is people talking about what the changes are going to be, assuming that the White House does in fact change and Biden comes in with a completely different economic game plan, which is going to, I believe, favor China, especially in the short run. It will return to being the low-cost provider, and in that kind of scenario, you're going to see exports jump.
Dan, what is your view on that? Should Biden win the election and become president, do you think the tariffs will go away?
I think Trump has an outstanding chance of winning the election, just for the record. So Biden clearly is perceived to be less confrontational, more globalist in nature. So I wouldn't be surprised if he embarks on a strategy like that. But let's face it, China actually wants to get out of the manufacturing business. This is not the long-term strategy for China. It's about services and it's about consumers. And so they have to replace that manufacturing business with something. We've just heard how import dependent it is for at least raw materials, for global supply chains, shipping in components that are perhaps assembled in China and then sold to the rest of the world. So this is not the be-all and the end-all for China. I do think Biden would be more conciliatory towards China and would embrace more some of the patterns of his predecessors. But Trump's not out of it yet by a long shot.
William Lee, what are your thoughts on that? China does see itself as being vulnerable in certain sectors, and as John just pointed out, we saw what happened to Huawei.
The danger of China going on its own, I think, is going to be very obvious. President Xi said a very interesting speech, had a very interesting speech in Shenzhen the other day, when he said that the success of Shenzhen was to build on the dictum of Deng Xiaoping to experiment, right? To cross the river by touching the stones and to experiment and to allow failure. One of the things that he also added to that, though, was that now innovation must take care and pay attention to the center. That top-down direction toward technology is something I find very dangerous, because countries that have tried that in the past, that industrial policy, whether it's Japan or Singapore, to try to direct the growth of technology, has more than not failed. And I think going forward, China has got to integrate its technology and standards with those of the rest of the world. I absolutely agree. China has a comparative advantage in a lot of the technological fields going forward. And the issue is to be able to develop standards in a way that integrates China's technology with the technology in the rest of the world. And I don't believe that Trump's policies are cutting that off. In fact, it's to protect China's intellectual property as well as America's intellectual property in a way that allows that integration to take place and allow the benefits to accrue to the developers of those technologies.
Einar, what are your thoughts on that? Do you see it the same way?
No, not at all. I mean, I've heard this tired argument before that somehow bashing China is protecting it. Quite frankly, China's success is an existential threat to a lot of people in America who believe in this kind of exceptionalism, that it's okay for the U.S. to do bad things in order to create the greater good. Very fascistic argument, and I really reject it. I think it's the wrong way to go. China has a different system, and it's been successful the last 40 years. Shenzhen, since it was mentioned, was growing at 20% GDP per year, 40 years. Imagine that. So how can you say that it's the wrong system, or that somehow the U.S. has to rein in China? I think it has to be cooperation. This is a multilateral world. This thinking that somehow the U.S. has all the answers, I think, is completely wrong.
Go ahead, William.
That's a complete distortion of what I said. I said Shenzhen's success was because it was able to copy the freestyling experimentation of Hong Kong. And what I was fearing going forward was the dictum that we need to now pay attention to the implications for the overall system. That constraint on innovation is something that could kill the goose that laid the golden egg. And in fact, this is not a tired tirade on my part, because I am trying to say China's standards are to be accepted and acknowledged by the rest of the world, and its property rights are to be protected just like everybody else's property rights. Surely you can't deny that the purpose of 21st century technology is to benefit the rest of the world by integrating the rest of the world. And that's the purpose of, I think, the Trump policy and the Xi policy prior to the COVID during the talks. And the next phase was supposed to be developing standards by which we can integrate technology, integrating technology as opposed to developing China's own technology and imposing it on the rest of the world.
All right, Dan, I want to move on.
You lost me on the idea that Trump is promoting integration.
Very quickly,
Well, I think,
Yeah, go
sure,
ahead, Dan. Go
sure.
ahead.
I mean, I'm just going to take it back to the comment about Shenzhen. I'm here in California, Southern California, to be specific. And, I compare what's occurred in Shenzhen with like what happened in California. California just took off. Innovation, creativity, for the most part, content, technology industries, some aerospace and defense. But, we've seen something similar happen here in the U.S. We've seen it occur in 40 years also in Shenzhen. Going back to President Trump and his attitude towards China, I think he's put things in about 3 different buckets. So there are things that China has, there are things that China needs, and there are things that the U.S. has. So how do those chess pieces get rearranged to the benefit not just of China, not just of the U.S.? Okay, and some things President Trump would say China has, and they probably shouldn't have had them. And he'd like to see those done on a more unilateral, cooperative basis between the countries. And I think that's starting to come to pass. And maybe he took out a baseball bat a couple of times to try to affect change or to get attention. But I think you're seeing that slowly coming to pass. And you're going to start to see companies getting through CFIUS for mergers and acquisitions. You're going to see flashpoints of areas that are of great importance to either country. We heard about semiconductors before.
Right.
You know about artificial intelligence. There's a lot of sectors here. So I think the equilibrium is returning from all the banter. But I think either side has to assert itself.
Although, Dan, we do hear very confrontational rhetoric coming from this White House. I mean, part of it could be attributed to the fact that we are in the middle of an election campaign, but it tends to be hostile.
Well, it is, and it's sort of Trump's rendition of the art of the deal. Right, so we have a transactional president who sees things as, who's going to make out, how is this going to happen, and who needs what I have, who has what I need, and he puts together deals.
William Lee, I've just got about 20 seconds left. I've got one final question. The IMF outlook for China, as I pointed out earlier on, is 8.2%. Do you think that's going to happen?
Well, as China's a locomotive, no, it won't happen. What we need to have is domestic demand be boosted in all of the individual continents like Europe and US. And China has to do its role in boosting domestic demand in a way that tries to improve the prospects for consumers and reduce the uncertainty that consumers face. The social safety net is absolutely vital.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.